Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and welcome to this week's episode of the YFP podcast, where we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. Today, I'm joined by my partner, certified financial planner, Tim Baker, and we're revisiting one of the most common questions that we've gotten since the very beginning of the podcast. And that is, should I pay off my debt? Here it's in reference to a mortgage, house payment, early, or should I invest the difference? So should I pay off my debt early or should I invest the difference? In fact, we tackled this exact question way back on episode 49 of the show. We'll link to that in the show notes. When a listener from Columbus asked if he should refinance his mortgage to free up cash to invest or stay the course and pay off the home in just 5 years. It sparked a great discussion back then, and it's just as relevant today. But here's what's different, right? The world has changed a lot since 2018 when we published that episode. Interest rates aren't as low as they were at the time. The stock market's been volatile over the past few years. Inflation and cash flow pressures are front of mind for many families. And yet the question remains, what's the best use of extra funds, extra dollars, whether that be attacking the mortgage or investing for the future? And as always, the answer isn't one size fits all. It depends on the math, yes, of course, but also on how you feel about the debt. Where are you in your career, your long-term goals, and how this decision fits into the bigger picture of your financial plan. So today, Tim Baker and I are going to walk through the numbers, revisit the lessons from that 2018 episode, and put them in context of 2025 so that you can think about how this applies to your own situation. But before we jump in, let's hear from today's sponsor, First Horizon. First Horizon is a paying sponsor of this episode of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Does saving 20% for a down payment on a home feel like an uphill battle? It's no secret that pharmacists have a lot of competing financial priorities, including high student loan debt, meaning that saving 20% for a down payment on a home may take years. First Horizon offers a professional home loan option, aka a doctor or pharmacist home loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers. It's 5% for non-first-time home buyers. Has no PMI and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to 806,500 in most areas. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. To check out the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to start the pre-approval process, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Tim, welcome back.
Good to be back, Tim. What's good?
Oh man, here fall in Ohio, favorite time of year. Doesn't get better than this. Football, leaves are changing, cool weather's coming, starting to make the transition into basketball season. Love fall, favorite time of year. So
it got cool quick. Like we had a day that was like 80 degrees, maybe like a week or two ago, and now like highs in the low 50s. Really cold in the morning. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. But yeah, I'm with you. Love the fall weather, changing the leaves, football, fall beers, all that stuff.
The only thing I hate about this time of year is, I might have shared this on the show before. When we bought our house, this was back in 2018. We looked at it in June, right? So when you look at a property in June, you don't yet see the reality of like, hey, this is a beautifully wooded property. It's gorgeous. It's got privacy. And then all the leaves start falling, right, in October. And, I remember the first few years we just spent Sunday afternoons basically raking leaves. We've gotten a much more efficient, system. But basically from mid-October through mid-December, man, the volume of leaves that we get is out of control. So
you got to get a guy for that, Tim.
Well, you know what? We do. We finally, and it's probably a good topic for the show, but like we finally looked at it and said, hey, what's the cost of time, right? 3-4 hours on a Sunday. And we finally hired it out, which is a big decision to let that go, but it was a good one. It was a good one. So
I think we would do 2 weekends where we would just blow the leaves, and the kids love that. But then it's like, all right, let's just offload this.
Yeah. At least in this season of life. I don't know. Maybe there's a future one where I'll enjoy raking again. It ain't this season of life right now.
Yeah. So, no, I'm with you.
All right. Well, I'm excited to jump into this episode. One of the most common questions we get, Tim, when we're speaking or we're talking with a group of pharmacists Almost every time in the Q&A, what comes up is, should I pay off my debt potentially early, whether it be a mortgage, student loans, et cetera? We'll talk about here from the mortgage standpoint, or should I invest, right? Put more towards investing in the long term. And I think it's one of those questions that there's an emotional component, there's a math component, and a lot of different opinions on this. And I was thinking about way back in 2018, I believe it was episode 49. We had a listener call in who had exactly this question related to the mortgage, which is, should I think they were 5 years away at the time. We'll link to that episode in the show notes, 5 years away from having the house paid off early. And they were getting some advice that, hey, don't keep making these aggressive house payments and have this debt gone. Actually, take it out longer, refinance it over 30 years, get a lower monthly payment, and then you can put more towards investments. And that was emotionally for that person, kind of catching them in a way of, hey, it goes against what I had thought was the best approach in terms of getting rid of the debt. Now, here we are in 2025 in a very different landscape that we were in 2018, right? When we look at mortgage rates on homes, although they've come down a little bit, we're seeing 30 years, even at times right around 6 or a little bit lower. We're seeing 20-year rates actually hovering in the fives at times. So they are coming down, but it's a very different environment than, when we bought homes 2018, 2019, 2020, 3% interest rates. People might have been refined in the high twos. And so how we look at this question in 2025, should I pay off my mortgage early or should I put more towards investments, is very different. So I want to make sure we spend some time on this because I suspect we have many others that are out there thinking this as well. So Tim, at a high level, how do you think about the math around this question? We'll talk about the emotional piece in a little bit, but the math around this question in 2025.
Yeah, I think when you're looking at an interest rate environment in the 2, 3, 4%, the math, if you're talking about total return, the math would suggest you pay the minimum payment on the mortgage and then, invest the difference, right? When you get into more of the 5, 6, 7% area, I think that becomes a little bit more murky from a mathematical perspective. Now, I know, Dave Ramsey, I think this is step 6, right? Is to pay off the mortgage in that whole process.
Yep.
And I think he would even push back on the math of that. He would say that, if you get to a point where the house is paid off and you can free up that house payment, and just have that stress-free air about you. I think he made a comment of like your grass feels different when your house is paid off versus not. I think he would push back on the math. I'm not convinced of that. And I don't know what I don't know what the crossover is like, once you go past 5.25%, I have no idea. Because the markets again are, ever changing, but I think this is something, Tim, quite honestly, I struggle with, right? And to prep for this episode, I looked at my own mortgage and, I was looking at the calculator and everything. So one of the things I was looking at was that my home won't be paid off until I'm 68 years old. It's a 30-year mortgage. Not great, right? I don't like that, right? So, and
that out loud for a minute, right? When you even when you say 68, I think sometimes some of these things where we look at long-term financial decisions, it's hard to imagine yourself in a future state, right? When you say 68 out loud, it almost forces you to slow down a little bit of like, oh, like what will that look like? Where will I be? And then to your point, how do I feel about that? And you just mentioned, I don't feel great, right?
Yeah, but then I look at my interest rate and, I'll probably pick off a lot of people that are maybe in the market for a home right now. The interest rate is 2.375%. So it's really, really, really hard for me to mathematically justify putting more money towards that. But I did it anyway this week because I just wanted to see how that felt. And if my payment is going to be, November of the year that I turned 68, which I forget, it's 20 some years from now. It was a little addicting to play with the calculator to see like, okay, if I do a one-time payment, can I get that down to 67? If I do a monthly payment or an annual payment, can I get that down to whatever age? So like, I don't know how long I'm going to work. Right now, I think I have my plan set at 65 or 67. Shay's 5 years younger than me. I love obviously what we do. I don't have an urge to do that, but maybe I wake up in my early 60s or late 50s, I don't know, and decide that, I want to do something else or whatever. So like, I think there's something to be said about, having flexibility. And if you extract out a mortgage, which is a major line item expense for a lot of people, that does free up, I think, things to do. One of the things you could always do is like liquidate the house, like sell the house and downsize. That's probably something that we're going to do anyway. So maybe a lot of this is moot, but, I think there is a total market, total return. And this kind of goes back to like, when we talked about, building a retirement paycheck, there's a kind of a total market, the systemic withdrawal strategy versus like creating a floor, right? Where you give up some of the total market, but for that safety of like, hey, that check's going to roll in the form of like an annuity payment, like a SPIA, it's kind of the same thing. But I like today, like I don't look at my mortgage payment and see, Ramsey says debt is servitude, right? I don't feel the stress. It doesn't register like that to me. But I've also never been in a place where like I'm completely debt free, right? So I don't necessarily know what that feels like. But it wasn't really on my radar until I started to look at this and like, because of the interest rate and how low it was, right? Because it's that interest rate, like you would say over the long term, if you invest those dollars, you're going to get a much, much greater return. If we go back to 2018 and that I was looking at what's been the return in the S&P 500, since that question was asked, and in the answer we gave, it's like, hey, I usually use about 7%. That's kind of what it was. It was 7.5%, 8% in there, that if you would have invested that, extra $1,000, that's what you would have gotten. So that's not always going to land, right? But to me, this is both a mathematical, question, but also how does it feel? How does the mortgage feel? And right now, like the pain that the mortgage gave me was so little, like it didn't even register. Like I should make, because we have other things that we're trying to do.
Yeah.
But I also could see like it could be very almost addicting to kind of get that down to like where, I pay it off at 65 and Shay's 60, you know what I mean? Like, so it depends. And just to kind of finish the thought, I think the reason that, Dave Ramsey, and I think it's why a lot of their things, like a lot of their stuff does work, is it's almost like a non-negotiable. He's like, he doesn't care about the interest rate, doesn't care about that. He believes that simplicity in this message and how most people approach the finances, that you want to go through these steps, and it's the secret to build wealth. And the problem with it depends is in the more nuanced approach, you're still left asking the question of like, okay, but what do I actually do? Like, if it depends for me, because we're tailoring the financial plan to you, there's a lot of gray area, right? And there's a lot of discovery in that in terms of like, okay, versus like, this is the prescription for everyone. You should do this and you'll be good. So I understand why they approach it that way.
Yeah, I do too. And I want to address the Ramsey piece for a minute because I've written about this. I think my philosophy has even evolved on this over time. Way back, episode 68, I talked about the pros and cons of the Ramsey baby steps. And I actually had a chance. APHA, gosh, this is probably maybe 2019, 2020. I can't remember. APHA was in Nashville. And I thought, hey, while I'm out there, I'm going to go visit the Ramsey offices just to kind of check them out. So took an Uber out there. Really cool place, building. And off record, there was a member of the Ramsey team. That's talking a little bit about what we do. And, I think I was sharing the gist of, I struggle that we look at every person the same, right? So if you look at pharmacists that are graduating, they have a couple $100,000 of debt. They're making $130,000 a year. That can be a very different financial situation than the 5 million people that they're blasting the show out to, every year. And they were pretty much admitting as much without admitting as much, that like when you're talking to 5 million people every day and obviously trying to create behavior and momentum, the whole point of the 7 baby steps is, it's to your point, a very methodical checklist type of system that, especially for two people, you have a North Star of what are we working on and how do we get there? And I don't think you can argue with the momentum and value of that. I think what we argue with is it the most efficient, optimized way to do it? And I would argue several parts of it are not, and we've talked about that before on the show. But I think it's worth saying that out loud that, even I think Dave, if we talked to him one-on-one, would probably say, oh, well, like what are the nuances of the situation, right? But when you're talking to 5 million people, but I think to the reason why, in part, they have the steps the way that they do that's related to this question, should I pay off my mortgage early or should I invest, is that there's an assumption that if we don't pay off the mortgage early, that we're actually going to take those dollars and invest those dollars. And I think what Ramsey would argue is that for many people, there may not be the discipline and behavior to actually do that, which favors the decision to pay off the debt. So that to me is almost like the question behind the question, which is, we get this all the time with like student loans, right? Should I opt into the payment that has the lowest monthly payment so I can pay extra if and when I want to? Yeah, mathematically, that makes sense. And then you put it toward the highest interest rate loan, unless you're pursuing forgiveness, different strategy. But do we actually have the discipline to take that approach versus forcing ourselves into a fixed higher monthly payment, right? Same kind of argument with a 15-year versus a 30-year mortgage. So I think it's worth addressing that as we talk about, should I pay off the mortgage early or should I invest? Like, if we decide not to pay off the mortgage early, of which I am currently in that camp as well, right? 3%, I don't have the sweet 2 whatever percent loan that you have, but 3%, like I'm kind of of the mindset, doesn't really bother me a whole lot about entering retirement with that. I want to optimize that interest rate, and whether it be putting it dollars elsewhere to invest or just putting dollars elsewhere to this phase of life and finding that balance of living a rich life, that's an intentional decision we're going to make, knowing that, hey, I've seen all the calculators, right? If you make an extra payment a year, it's going to go from a 30 to 23, yada, yada, yada. Not to say that's not the right move for others, but, for us, we've kind of decided against that. So love to hear your thoughts just on, that idea of the decision is under the assumption, if we choose to take out the mortgage longer, that we're actually going to invest the difference.
Well, it's the same thing that we've been talking about recently on the podcast is like buy term, invest the difference. The problem, the flaw in that, like, are you going to invest the difference?
Right.
And if you're investing towards like a retirement number, I need to get to 2 million, 3 million, maybe it's a little bit easier to like invest the difference. But if you're not, it's kind of like you're out into the ether. You're just taking that $1,000, hopefully you scheduled it, and you're putting it into, an IRA, a Roth IRA, a brokerage account. And, so like I think that is the difference, is like, I can log into my, my mortgage and, put money in and then see that principal go down. And then I can see how it changes. Like, now it's going to be paid off in this month of this year. Like, that can be very, very centering and very addicting. Right. And I know that, the extra money that I just paid just for kicks, like, I know that if I were to invest that over, that money over, 20 years, it's probably going to do a lot better than just paying off the mortgage. But, and that's why I do think it's not just a mathematical thing. It's also an emotional thing, which is what we talk about with other parts of the financial plan, the other parts of the debt. So yeah, like I think there is, it's one of the things that, we talked about with like, clients is like, okay, like if you put an extra $20,000 in your emergency fund, does that cause you to sleep a little bit better at night? And if the answer is that is yes, then freaking do it. If it's like, whatever, then like, let's get that money into the market, So that's kind of what we're talking here. So I don't think, again, there's no right or wrong answer. I think there is a right and wrong answer from a math, but these are also projections, right? Like, we're thinking that the market is going to go up 7 to 8% every year, but maybe in the future it doesn't. But over the 100+ years of the S&P 500, we've never had a rolling 20-year period where it's been negative, right? And it's actually, even 10 years, it's mostly positive. So that's kind of what we're saying here. And I think that the nuance of your situation, like, again, like it didn't even really register with me, because I'm like, our interest rates are so nice that I'd rather be doing other things like investing the money or doing things today in 2025 with my family or with projects on the house that enhances our, ability to live a wealthy life today. But I can see the allure of, waking up one day and be like, hey, I'm free and clear of everything. And again, like if I had a mortgage that was in 5, 6, 7%, I probably would be looking at that more, when we had a bonus come in or something like that, or just putting that into the budget, because again, the delta between, I think, what the market could return over the long term and, what you're paying in interest is a lot smaller. Now, I think another thing that plays into it depends here, Tim, is like your timing. So I'm in my early 40s. If I was in my mid 50s, I'm not the timeline is different, right? So like I'm probably doing a lot more with the extra cash that I have to improve my financial position on the debt side, because I just don't have the runway, so to speak. If I'm thinking about this, from the aspect of drawing down for retirement, I don't have as much runway that I do in my early 40s. So, if I'm a pre-retiree, then I think the situation changes. So, but I think other variables here is like, how do you view debt and risk? The interest rate, what we talked about. How do you view the stock market? I think also stability of your income. Like if you're sitting here and you're thinking like, hey, in 10 years, maybe my job doesn't exist because of AI or whatever. Maybe there are things that you're doing to kind of inoculate yourself a little bit more from those, from the shift in job market and the AI revolution, all that kind of stuff. So, I do think that there's things at play here that, again, that's not just a mathematical equation. It's just how you view the world, how you view risk, debt, et cetera.
Let me pick your brain on something. I was thinking about, for the person listening, right now that bought a home, let's say in the last 4 years, right? So they have an interest rate somewhere probably north of 6%.
Yeah.
Let's assume they have no student loan debt that's higher than that. So, they don't have like private loans at 10%, which obviously would favor to pay off the higher interest rate debt, unless it was, federal and we're talking loan forgiveness. Let's assume they don't have any high interest rate revolving credit card debt. We'll assume they've got a good foundation in place, which is another piece, right? Do they have the emergency fund, those types of things in place before we think about extra debt payment? But for that person, I'm thinking about, especially since we recorded an episode a couple weeks ago on, active versus passive investing. I could see somebody struggling with this question right now in the moment, which is like, hey, I have a mortgage at 6%. Yes, I've got to save for retirement for the future. But because given the interest rate is a little bit higher. Oh, and by the way, like the market is, has been hot, and we could have said the same thing 6 months ago and it's still gone up over time. But like, would that then favor, because, market's real hot, then maybe I should not buy in high and pay off my mortgage. Oh, I could refinance in the future is another variable to think about in here.
Right.
So in this moment, I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like in this moment at the 6-7% 30-year rates, given the conditions we're in, how does somebody think about it? How is this equation different?
So, I ran the math. I looked at a 3% interest rate on a $500,000 mortgage over 30 years. You pay about $259,000 in interest. When that goes up to 7%, so not 6, but 7%, the amount of interest that you pay over 30 years goes from $259,000 to $698,000, right? So that's quite the swing.
3 to 7% you're talking about.
Correct. Over 30, over 30 years.
3% to 7%. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so not quite the 6% example that you gave. But like when we were in Baltimore and we were, doing some different, we refi, and then we did a full renovation, and there was some finance in there. I think at one point our rate was up at like 4.6%. And I'm like, geez, like it seemed high at the time. And I think what my default at the time would be to do the extra payment, right? Shave 7 years. I think that's probably like where if it would have stayed there, I probably would have stayed there in terms of that payment structure. So, if our if our mortgage was $2,200, you know, I'm saving that on the side and making that towards principal once a year or on a monthly basis or whatever that looks like. So I think that if I'm in that space, Tim, of 6%, and again, given all things are equal, like we're not working through any other debt. We talk about the spectrum of like good debt and bad debt. And again, I think that line of where you draw good debt and bad debt, it's going to be different for everyone. Like, I think if you have a car note, I'm still prioritizing that. I think my hope with, you know, a lot of our clients, if they come to us and they're early in their career, they might have one car note and then we're essentially transitioning into one. And then eventually you're just paying cash for your car, like, you know, mid to late career. But once you get beyond that, and we're assuming the student loans are either gone or working through a forgiveness strategy, then I think a extra house payment, you know, at 6 or 7% makes a ton of sense. And then I would probably build from there if I'm there. And I actually, to be honest, Tim, I'll probably do that with my own situation at 2.3%, because part of me, and I don't think there's a mathematical basis, but part of me wants that mortgage to be paid off closer to like my target retirement. And if you ask me why, I'm like, I don't know. That's just how I feel. Like, I just want more of that flexibility. It might get to a sense where, like, if I'm going to retire at 60, maybe I want to do it, or at 60, or 65, maybe I want to do that at 60 to give myself a little bit more flexibility. So I think that's what I would do to answer your question, is to start working towards making that extra payment. Again, that's not a ton to shave off 7 years worth of interest. But a lot of people are maybe looking around and be like, Tim, what are you talking about? I can barely make ends meet with all the things that I have. So again, I think that's why we take this in phases. But, you know, part of me, as I click that button to make that extra payment, is like, I want to pull it back, because I believe the market, you know, and over the long term will take really, really good care of you. But I think in this instance, this is less about the math and more about the emotion and how I feel, you know, as my kind of next phase of my life goes into retirement. So was that the answer you were expecting, or no?
Yeah, it was. And I think you blended the emotional and the math. You know, two things are coming up for me is I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot about in this phase of life is the exhaustion with unanswered questions. And this transcends the financial plan, like just, you know, phase of life, kids activities, all these things, right? There can be all these open loops that are out there that, you know, we revisit some of the same decisions sometimes. And we see this in the financial plan happen a lot. And I'm not saying be abrupt in your decision making. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm also getting to is that there's value in having some flexibility, life changes, but there's also value sometimes in like thoughtfully planning through the strategy, coming up with your game plan and automating it and moving on.
Yeah.
You know, because I think some of these questions can become exhausting over time, and maybe your philosophy changes, situation changes, life event changes that really forces you to revisit that. Absolutely. I'm not saying close the book and never revisit it, but I do think there can be an exhaustion that can come with constantly having questions like these that are unanswered. And then you extrapolate that over the rest of the financial plan. Well, you know, should it be kids' college, or should it be retirement, or, you know, what should I do with this piece of the financial plan, et cetera. The other thing that was coming up for me is you're talking about, unrelated to what I just said there, is, to me, I think there is one caveat. You know, the thought that was coming to mind is the calculators will always convince you to go in one direction, right? Whether you're crunching numbers on your mortgage, and as you said, can be somewhat addicting. You're like, oh man, what if I make that extra payment, right? I can knock off 7 years. And like, where does that stop, right? So like the calculators will always be enticing. Same is true with savings. Like, I could always spend it. I could always not spend on this one thing in life and put $300 more a month there. The calculators will always win. Like that the math will always win. But there's that balance that we've talked about on repeat on the show. So that would be the one caveat I'd throw in here with the 6% question I posed, which is like, even if the rest of the financial plan is relatively clean, like the math will favor paying off that debt versus investing. But is there almost like an option 3 of also finding the balance of living the life today? You know, that's kind of where I'm going. Like, I could throw an extra $1,000 toward my mortgage, and maybe you're already finding that balance, right? So it's a moot point. And I'm not even talking necessarily in specific your situation, But I would just throw that back into the mix here because we can go down the rabbit hole a little bit on the math side of things. And especially for the nerds that are listening that love to nerd out on these calculators, it will entice you to pay it off early or to invest more, whatever would be the decision.
Yeah, because it shows you, not, the more enticing thing for me is like where it says like, okay, now you're going to pay it off in not November of this year, but October of that year, or, April of the year before that, right? And then it shows you like the amount of interest that you're going to save. Now, if it also showed you like what that could potentially grow if you assume a 7 or 8% interest rate, like maybe that changes, you hitting the button on that. Obviously, they're not going to do that. But one of the things that you mentioned is like, the potentially using that money for, so like if I were to take that, say it's $2,000, let's say I would, instead of putting that towards my mortgage, I were to take that and do a trip to New York City with my kids or whatever. I don't know if I could, keep it under 2,000, probably not. That might just be hotels. But like, what I'm saying is like, but then I have 30, 40, 50 years of that experience banked in my memory. Like that pays, I think that's one of the things that, what is it? Die with Zero. He puts forward is like
experience dividend.
Yeah. Like the experience dividend. If I wait to do that, like, let's say I wait to do that when I'm retiring, like my kids are old, they're grown, they have their own lives. If I do that,
and they're probably not going to want to go to New York City with you, by the way.
Right. But if I do that now, I then enjoy that. Yeah. I then enjoy that memory over X amount of decades. Right. So
yeah,
there's a lot of utility in that as well. If you think about it in that breath. So, I think it's a great question to ask. And I think a lot of people, we get into this like autopilot of things and we don't ask these critical questions.
Yeah.
And we don't check in with ourselves and say like, hey, because I think we can, especially if you have a particular money script, you will skew to that one side versus, I'm a saver, I'm a spender. And like, we don't do kind of an azimuth check to make sure that we're still on the path that we want to be on. But it's so much more than just the mathematical equation. And again, like, I think it depends on where you sit and kind of what the finances look like. But I will say, and maybe this is true back in the day when, interest rates were 17, 18%, but it's very rare that I talk to a prospective client and they say like, my mortgage is killing me, right? You typically see that with student loans, credit card debt, personal debt. It's very rare where you're like, I'm talking to someone, they're like, I have to get out of this. Like I have to pay this off. It's suffocating. It gives me anxiety.
Interesting.
So, take that for what it's worth. I've done many of those meetings. I don't think I've had one. I've probably done 2,000 of them, Tim. I don't think I've had one person that was like, I got to pay this off yesterday. So maybe that's an indication of like, we don't take that Dave Ramsey. We're just like, hey, this is good debt. Like that's maybe a widely adopted notion of like a mortgage, and people talk about the tax write-off, and that a lot of that's gone away with like the new tax code. That wouldn't be a reason that I would keep a mortgage around. It's just because of the tax write-off. But it's very rare that people are like, they're pointing to that as like, hey, I need to get free and clear of that.
Yeah.
So
let me ask you one more question, which is, I think this is a good question that brings together the emotional and the math, especially if those are not in sync with one another. So I'm thinking about risk tolerance, risk capacity in the context of this question. So if I'm someone who emotionally just really wants my mortgage paid off, put aside the interest rate for a moment, 6%, 3%. I need the debt cleared. Emotionally, it's stressful, it's anxious. I want to be clear and debt free as soon as possible. Therefore, I want to put extra money I have towards it. However, when we get to other parts of the financial plan, like saving for retirement, being on track for retirement, we identify that there's a deficit there, right? There's a gap in terms of what we need to have saved to reach our retirement goals. A lot of nuance in there, obviously, of, target retirement age, risk that we're taking, asset allocation, et cetera. But at a high level, what I'm bringing forward here is this idea that there's some friction with this question emotionally with where we potentially need to go in terms of the math and achieving some of these other goals. How would you, for someone listening, it's like, yeah, that's me. Like, how would you begin to bring that forward or develop a plan or kind of help someone work through some of those objections that we can reconcile those, right? Because if we solve one of those issues emotionally, we pay off the loan early, we potentially have another emotional issue later on, whether we feel it now or not, which is I'm not prepared for retirement.
Yeah, and I think what you could argue is like, okay, if you now free up whatever your mortgage payment would have been, and then do that for the next X amount of years, like you're gonna make it's gonna be potentially a rocket ship, right? So if you're investing in a mortgage type payment that you wouldn't have otherwise done, in a short span of time, you can, and I think that's what we would model. So like, I think what I would do is I would ask the question of like, what is the like the emotional underlying reason why we need to pay it off? And like, I think once we kind of blow that smoke away, you might be like, I don't really know why. Maybe it's what I was taught, or maybe it's what I heard, someone say that, kind of went through the baby steps. So I think I would diagnose that. And then I think a lot of pharmacists enjoy the data. So like, I think we would then project out the different scenarios, like the scenario of, paying, being more debt focused and then flipping the switch in X amount of years to being more investment focused versus kind of doing them in tandem, and then show the mathematical, we can get really nerdy and show like, hey, Tim, if you do this option A, at 65, you're going to have a 71% chance that you'll have money at the end of your plan at age 95 or 100, whatever we set out. If we do option B, maybe there's a 52% chance that you'll have money, and then we talk about that from that perspective. So I think it's, again, it goes back to the emotion and the math, right? I think we would, kind of get to the underlying fear or concern or whatever that looks like. It could be like, hey, I've had these conversations with clients and prospective clients where it's like, my dad died at 50, my uncle died at 55. Like there's a health concern that like the time that I have here on earth is limited. So it's either like, I want to live now, or I want to be in a position to make sure that my partner is okay. And maybe a good reason for that, it would be to pay off the house. So I think this is the life, right? So it's really kind of diving into that nuance and dissecting. And then I think the next step, which I think a lot of the average person, the average DIYer is not equipped to do, is to kind of take the data and then project out those different paths with confidence to say, okay, if we run these scenarios and we run these simulations, like this is what it looks like, and then continue the conversation from there.
Yeah.
I think that's where the magic happens. And I think that's what those decisions or those types of projections have then informed the decisions that we're making in 2025, whether that is to continue to invest or maybe to get more gazelle-like from a debt payoff. And then again, check in with the plan, year over year to make sure that, hey, we're still on track. So I think it's dissect the emotion and then, project the data and then let the client decide, based on that information, what the best path forward. I think what we do by default is kind of stick our finger in the air and be like, okay, the wind is blowing this way. I think this is what I want to do, but it's not based on data. And again, we've talked about these calculators. So many times I'll ask a prospective client, it's like, hey, are you on track for retirement or what? And they're like, well, the calculator says I am. And those are like the narrowest of views, right? Because how the heck does a calculator know like what your burn rate is going to be in retirement? They have no idea, right? So, again, I think a more comprehensive approach is needed, especially when we're talking about a pharmacist's income and in what their net worth should be. In both of those things, we should be now or in the future in the top 3 to 5% of Americans in terms of the income that we make and the net worth that we should have amassed over the course of our careers.
I love how you approach that, right? Because I think that really, to me, speaks of the value of financial planning, right? Can we work through and surface the emotions, dissect those, what's going on, honor them, right? We're not stuffing them down, honor them, bring them to light, talk through them, look at the different options, add an objective element to that. Let's look at scenario A, B, or C. How do we then bring the emotions into that? How do we feel about that? From there, we then develop a plan and a path forward. And as I was alluding to a little bit earlier, right, we close that loop, and we don't have that exhaustion of the unanswered question, or did we get this right? Are we doing this correctly? Should we do more here, less there? Like, we look at all the pieces of the puzzle, think about the emotions, think about the math behind them, develop a plan, work that plan, stay accountable to that plan. That is the art and life of financial planning. And so as we wrap up today's episode, just a reminder, right? This debate that we're talking about, it's not about finding the perfect financial answer. It's finding the answer, not for just this, but the rest of the financial plan that balances the math with the emotions, with the mindset, and your overall goals that you have. And so if you're wrestling with a question like this or another part of your financial plan, or how to put together the different pieces, we would love to have a conversation to learn more about your situation, share more about our one-on-one fee-only financial planning services, and to determine whether or not there's a good fit there. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Tim, as always, great stuff. And thanks to everyone for joining the show this week. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the YFP podcast. Do us a favor. If you like what you heard during this episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show, which will help other pharmacists find the show as well. And before we wrap up, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the YFP podcast, First Horizon. First Horizon offers a professional home loan, aka doctor or pharmacist loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single family home or townhome for first-time buyers. That's 5% for non-first-time home buyers. Has no PMI and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to 806,500 in most areas. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii, and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. And finally, an important reminder that the content in this episode of the podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding material should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial product. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great rest of your week.